Okay, Michael, we're ready to go.
Good morning, buenos dias a todos y a todas, and thank you all for joining us. This morning, we're going to engage our distinguished speakers and many very knowledgeable participants about the rapidly evolving situation of migration flows in the Americas. We'll devote particular attention to those migrants coming to the US and the Biden administration's response. According to Department of Homeland Security data, it's expected that at least 1.5 million US-bound migrants will have left their homes this year, which is double the level of 2019, a year with high numbers of migrants. The dramatic and tragic situation with an estimated 14 or 15,000, mostly Haitian refugees and migrants in Del Rio, Texas, makes the discussion today particularly timely and important. There are two familiar migration stories that have been amply covered. The first is the migration to the US from Central America's Northern Triangle countries, which the Biden administration has dealt with an approach focused on root causes. The second is the unprecedented migration refugee crisis stemming from Venezuela's collapse and humanitarian catastrophe. The numbers now are approaching 6 million over the past 6 or 7 years. But there are new and unexpected phenomena and dynamics that demand attention and analysis. From Central America, against some projections, the numbers continue to rise, intensifying pressure on the US southern border. And in addition to the Northern Triangle countries, migrants escaping the deteriorating situation in Nicaragua are also heading to the United States in significant numbers. Why are these numbers increasing? What are the new drivers? What is the role of climate change, of COVID, or governance failures, violence? We'll be exploring all these factors. And on Venezuela, are the destinations of refugees changing? Are more coming to the United States? Are some returning to Venezuela? And I think it's important to note that early on, the Biden administration granted temporary protective status to Venezuelans in the United States. We also want to take a look at Mexico, its role in cooperating with the US and dealing with Central American challenge, its position on the Remain in Mexico policy, and also the notable increase of Mexican migration to the United States after it had leveled off for years. And on Haiti, how do we explain the current crisis? Many of these refugees had lived for years in Chile, Brazil, Panama, and other countries. And why are they concentrating now on the US southern border? Is deportation based on the Title 42 for public health the right policy response? What are other options that should be considered? The data from the Department of Homeland Security also show a very sharp increase in migration to the United States from Ecuador. What accounts for this striking phenomena? There's been a 600% increase from 2019 to 2021. And finally, what are the implications of increasing numbers of new migrants for remittance flows, which, as we know, are increasingly important part of the economy for many countries in the region? In short, there are many issues to address and a lot of ground to cover this morning. Fortunately, we have a first-rate group of experts to shed light and share their knowledge and insights so all of us can better understand the complexities of the current situation, where things might be headed, and what policy measures should be pursued. Let me introduce them briefly in the order in which they'll speak. You can consult their full and very impressive bios on our website. Andrew Seeley is the president of the Migration Policy Institute, a very good friend of the dialogue, a close collaborator and partner. He joins us this morning from Costa Rica. Thanks so much, Andrew, for being with us. Carolina Jimenez Sandoval is in Washington, D.C. She is the president of the Washington Office on Latin America, or WOLA, and I want to take this opportunity to extend a heartfelt congratulations to Carolina as she takes on this new and very important role. And we continue to look forward to partnering with WOLA as the dialogue has done in the past. Daniela Sileri is the Associate Researcher of the Department of Sociology at Levine's Hanover University. Daniela joins us for the first time. We're very happy to have her. She joins us from Quito, Ecuador. We really appreciate her participation. And finally, Manuel Orozco, very familiar to many of the participants on this event, who is currently the Director for Migration and Economic Stabilization at Creative Associates International. He also is a non-resident senior fellow at the Dialogue, and I want to thank Manuel for his continued very valuable collaboration with the Dialogue, and especially for his contribution, enormous contribution in organizing this event. The Dialogue, of course, has a longstanding interest and concern with migration. It's been a major issue on the inter-American agenda, particularly for Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, but also very relevant in South America as well. As part of this concern and initiative, the Dialogue is participating in a North and Central America task force on migration, which emphasizes a regional approach to this challenge. And we're working together with the Migration Policy Institute, the Center for U.S.-Mexico Studies, the Colegio de Mexico, and the World Refugee and Migration Council. And we've produced some excellent research products on relevant themes. Our current program focuses on migration and development and conditions in Guatemala, in particular on financial access and inclusion and creating economic opportunity. We recently released a migration mainstreaming toolkit, a guide for local governments, financial institutions, and civil society, outlining how the migration process can be most effectively leveraged for development goals. I want to thank Gaston Ocampo for his excellent coordination of this event, and just remind everybody before we begin, if you would like to pose a question and join the conversation, please use the raise the hand function on Zoom or send us an email to meetings@thedialogue.org. And thanks again to everybody for joining. And let me get started now with a first question to Andrew Seeley. Perhaps no one tracks migration as closely as you do, and perhaps you can give us a little bit of the big picture about why we're seeing all these changes, some of which I think were unexpected, and particularly maybe telling us a little bit about the Mexican migration. Why is this happening now? And of course, we welcome your comments on what's happening, and also Del Rio with the Haitian phenomena. What's going on? It's just the spread of disinformation, bad information. In Guatemala, the vice president said, if you're not legal, don't come. But it seems like a lot of people are coming. So let me turn it over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Michael, and great to be at the Dialogue. Thank you, Manuel, also for organizing this. I mean, thank you both. It's always great to be with you at the Dialogue, and what a great panel. And also, let me extend my welcome to Carolina Jimenez. Great to have her at WOLA as well. If we'd had this conversation, in fact, we did have this conversation about 3 years ago at the Dialogue. We were talking about how most of the migration was not to the US anymore. It was in the region. People were going to Colombia and Ecuador and Peru and Costa Rica, where I am right now. I mean, from Nicaragua and Venezuelans and Haitians going to Brazil and Chile. And, the migration was in the region. That is still true. There's still a lot of migration going on within the region, not quite on the same scale, though we don't know what will happen in situations, in the situation in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Haiti, and Cuba, and how this may affect future migration patterns. But the attention is back on the US-Mexico border. But I would argue to you, and this is my first point to you, is that this is actually not new. This is a continuation of trends that have been out there for a long time. The numbers are striking. The numbers have gone up, but they haven't gone up as much as they look like they've gone up for 2019. There's an enormous amount of continuity from 2019 because Title 42, and I'll explain this in a minute, Title 42 has done some things that create incentives for repeat migration, for people to try multiple times to enter. The numbers we're seeing are encounters rather than individuals. You should probably take about 37% off the numbers, probably close to 50% for adults, much less for families, and probably close to zero for unaccompanied minors. What that tells you is we're back to numbers similar to 2007, 2008 in terms of individuals. We're near above the numbers in 2019 by a little bit, but it's not quite as big a shift. And this is actually a continuation of trends we've seen over time. These have been the repeated migration waves that have been happening really since 2014 and are a continuation of that. What is new, however, and this is significant, is the number of nationalities arriving at the same time at the border. And I think that is significant. This was primarily an issue of Central Americans and to some extent Mexicans. And the Mexican numbers, I will say, I know Manuel will talk more about this as well, but the Mexican numbers are interesting because they've doubled, over time. But because they're almost entirely single adults, you have to assume about 50%. So the numbers have probably gone up slightly, but not in large numbers. That said, I suspect there are many more Mexicans staying and actually getting into the United States than in the past. So the number of encounters, the number of actual individuals encountered at the border may not be increasing, but the number getting into the US may in fact be increasing quite significantly. And the reasons behind that are similar as for Central Americans. So why is this happening now? One is we should assume some of this migration is normal. We should assume actually that countries that are developing, that still have weak rule of law, that have few opportunities for people to get ahead in their own countries, places like Honduras and Guatemala, where people are entering the workforce in large numbers and the workforce can't accommodate that. We should assume that this is a feature, not a bug of the system. And we should assume they're going to come to the United States because there are historical ties here. And so we have to figure out how not to stop that migration, but manage it in a way that's sensible. And over time, some of that natural migration process will hopefully, and this is not predetermined, hopefully will change. It'll change because fertility patterns are already changing in those countries, so it'll reduce some job pressures. It will change because income is going up slightly, even despite all the problems. It may not may change faster or slower, depending on what happens in those. So some of this is natural. Some of this, we know there have been enormous conflicts in the region. So there's endemic violence in places like Honduras and El Salvador, parts of Guatemala, obviously a political conflict in Nicaragua, as well as in Venezuela, incredible turmoil in Haiti for a number of reasons, man-made and natural, and people are gonna be leaving. And so we should be figuring out, my first point on why is some of this is happening for reasons we can predict, and we should be assuming ahead of time that we're going to be managing this for a long time. And in fact, we should be thinking in terms of the larger region in how we manage this, right? This is not just a US issue. This is an issue for the Americas to be managing. We should not assume zero migration is normal. We should assume, there is normal migration, people moving back and forth for opportunities, but there's going to be migration pressures, and we should be thoughtful about how we do this. Secondly, COVID introduced some new pressures, partially because it interrupted people's livelihoods in very significant ways and created new reasons for people to want to leave. COVID was incredibly hard. This was a recession that was incredibly hard on the poor because many of the livelihood strategies that people pursue when economies go badly in their countries involve going out into the informal market in ways you couldn't do during a lockdown. And so this was an incredibly punishing cycle for many people who are already low income, who lost their access to income. And so there are huge incentives to move now in a way that there probably weren't. Add a couple of hurricanes in Central America would add on. But this is where I'll focus more. There's also a policy component in this, which is that we have pursued a series of patchworks in how to manage the border, none of which are working very effectively. They all succeed in deterring migration for a period of time, but they ultimately don't work very well. And we've never come up with a system that actually makes sense in terms of managing migration in a regular, safe, predictable way. And where we'll get to at the end here is saying, we really need to head to that. But Title 42 looks like a really, complete measure to stop people from coming across the border. It turns out not to be terribly effective. It actually has some very perverse incentives built in for people to try multiple times to cross the border, particularly adults who are in a better position to do that and who are willing to do so. And so you've seen lots of adults trying to come, knowing that they're going to have to try 5 or 10 times. They may get robbed or worse, but it's a risk that they're going to take to do it because they're getting sent back to the border community where they can try anew. And so it's actually created an incentive for people to come. The Biden administration decided early on that it was going to take in unaccompanied minors. Frankly, the Trump administration had mostly been doing that as well. This has largely been US policy for a long time, take in unaccompanied minors and run them through, in the case of non-Mexicans and non-Canadians, a process in the immigration courts to determine their needs for protection. But they made an explicit decision which led to a boom in unaccompanied minors coming. And then over time, for a variety of reasons, which involve Mexican and US policy, the number of families admitted continued to increase until it reached somewhere above 80 or 90% in June and July. So most families were actually being admitted to were actually being allowed into the United States, and told to report at either an ICE office or at an immigration court in their final destination. This happened originally because many families, the Mexican government wouldn't take them back because the numbers were so great in the Rio Grande Valley, in Tamaulipas on the Mexican side, in Coahuila. It eventually happened because there were some nationalities that were not part of the agreement for Title 42 with Mexico, Venezuelans and Nicaraguans and Ecuadorians and Brazilians and Haitians and others, and therefore the US could not send them back to Mexico. There were others, humanitarian cases that the US decided to accept. But in the end, Title 42 has proved to be neither a deterrent, nor has it proven to be a fair way of managing the border, because there's no protection. If you show up with a protection need at the border, you're no more likely to get in than someone that doesn't have a protection need. There's no protection screening whatsoever. That said, it's also become very ineffective as a deterrent because the vast majority of families are getting in, or at least we're up through July, getting into the United States. That has created a huge incentive for other people to come. Obviously, I mean, this is, the more you know of people that have successfully come in, the more likely you are to come. And I suspect in the case of the Haitians, this was most of whom had left their country a decade ago, most of whom moved to Brazil. Brazil offered humanitarian visas to Haitians after the 2010 earthquake. They were also building stadiums for the Olympics and the World Cup. They had labor market needs. They gave many tens of thousands of Haitians humanitarian visas that allowed for permanence. Many moved on to Chile and Ecuador after the Brazilian economy sputtered. And there were about 170,000 Haitians in Chile as of 2020. There are fewer in Ecuador, though still a large number, and still a large number in Brazil as well. My guess is a large part of the reason why Haitians are coming now is because they can, because this was the moment of being able to do it. There was probably misinformation about the TPS thrown in there as well. But also the reality is some Haitians had gotten in, and so this is the moment to come in. So where do we go? And this is where I want to say just a couple minutes, Michael, if I can, on how do we begin to respond to this in a sensible way. One is we've got to stop putting patchworks together. I mean, this what we've largely done in the past is a series of measures that are temporary in nature, that are not thought to be permanent, and that are largely designed to try and stop rather than manage migration. So we need to think about what looks like a more permanent system. And by the way, I fear in that right now what's going to happen is we're going to see a backlash. We're seeing it already, and it'll be enforcement heavy. They're going to throw whatever they can at this because it's become a political issue, and you're going to see heavy enforcement. But where we need to get to is actually a balanced mix of a number of measures. So one is, a robust protection system at the border, using the asylum rule they've proposed to have a fair and efficient asylum system at the border, and using returns to people's country of origin for those that don't meet protection needs. And you can err on the side of being broad in protection. You can also think about complementary protection for people who might not meet the exact bar for the conventions and the judicial interpretation, but clearly face needs for protection. It would clearly be in danger if they're returned to their country. So that mixture we need to figure out, but it is going to involve returns. It is going to involve supervised ways of handling people while their judgment is happening. It doesn't have to be detention, but there have to be ways of managing people's cases and deciding whether or not they're returned at the end of their case. Secondly, we need to begin thinking about legal pathways. And this was easier when we were primarily talking about Hondurans and Guatemalans. It gets more complicated when we talk about the rest of the region. But certainly for Hondurans and Guatemalans, we know people are going to be coming for a long time. Let's try and create legal pathways for people to have an alternative to an irregular journey. And there's a huge opportunity with the H-2 program to do this. The H-2 program has lots of problems. We need to build worker protections into it. But it is a pathway that exists, and in absence of congressional action, it's the only one we have. And it would give people an alternative that at least gives them some protections over what they have now as undocumented migrants, because people are going to come one way or the other. This is a huge opportunity, and it's a huge area we should be focusing on. We also need to think of layered protection for Central America, which is how do we think about, and I'm sure Carolina will talk more about this, but how do we think about protecting people in their countries, as they're displaced within their countries, in neighboring countries, Costa Rica and Mexico, which have robust asylum systems, at the US border, but also using the US refugee program more strategically, at least for small numbers of people who are in danger, so we can resettle them before they actually have to flee. Finally, we have to think also about what we do in terms of those countries further abroad. How do we support Colombia and Ecuador as they're doing regularization programs and trying to integrate people who have arrived? What do we do in the larger region to have a dialogue about managing migration? And finally, how do we invest? And I know Manuel will talk about this. How do we invest in communities of origin so people don't have to leave? And so we build rule of law, and we build, and I know also Carolina, I'm talking about this. How do we build rule of law? How do we build development opportunities so people don't feel obliged to leave in the future? Let me leave one coda, and with this I'll stop, which is we have a huge interest in getting to a balanced migration shutdown as under the Trump administration. Americans feel that it's not fair. And you saw the huge reaction against this. It was unpopular. People have a notion of fairness. People want those who arrive at the border to be treated fairly. At the same time, when it seems like the border's out of control, it poisons the political debate in the United States about immigration. And it makes it hard to have sensible conversations about DACA, about TPS, about bringing people out of the shadows who are working and living in this country already, and about fixing our visa system, which really needs to be updated in significant ways. So we need to find a way of having a balanced system that both treats people fairly at the border, but also makes judgments about who comes in and who doesn't. And in part is able to do this fairly because it creates other channels for people to come legally to the United States, right? And we never really invested in that, but that's a huge opportunity to try and create those legal pathways. We've actually done it with Mexico to some extent, but not with other countries. In the end, it is about the US border, but managing the US border comes down to managing a broader regional migration system, both with Central America, but with all of the Americas, with South America, the Caribbean, Central America. We aren't going to be able to do this alone. We aren't going to be able to do it without the Canadians. We aren't going to be able to do it without Mexico. We can't do it by temporary measures. Our temporary measures are to ask Mexico to do more enforcement in the South and do temporary measures like Title 42 or MPP at the border. Those things aren't going to work. We actually have to move towards more permanent, a more permanent way of managing migration over time. Thank you.
Great, Andrew, thank you. That was absolutely terrific. Really, really helpful, and raised a lot of excellent points that I'm sure there'll be questions and we'll follow up, but thank you very much. Carolina, let me turn it to you, and I welcome your own perspective on some of the issues that Andrew touched on. What's happening at the border now with the Haitians, mostly Haitians, the Biden administration's response both to that problem, but also its approach towards migration in general, how you see it, and if you can also tell us a little bit about the Venezuelan phenomena and what are the patterns? Is the outflows continuing apace? Are there changes in that we should be aware of? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for your very welcoming words. Same to Andre, and I'm incredibly happy to be surrounded by great panelists, and thank you, Manuel, for the invitation as well. Let's start by, very briefly touching upon some of the issues you raised at the beginning on the current, border crisis, and I think Andrew provided an excellent, overview and context of what we're seeing. But needless to say, the news of the last few days are focusing, of course, on the Haitian migrants that are being, deported to a country that many of them have not been to in many years, in a country that we all know it's immersed in a major, humanitarian and political crisis. I think one important thing to remember, and sadly we tend to forget this, is that migration doesn't start at the US-Mexico border, right? I mean, the US-Mexico border is one, point in the whole migration cycle. And migration starts in communities of origins. Migration starts in transit countries for some people. Migration starts in a destination country that no longer, provides living conditions or safety for people who have lived there for some time. So when we look at the Haitian crisis, we tend to forget that for years, many Haitian migrants were forced to leave Haiti, and this has happened for decades, of course, and moved to Brazil, some moved to Chile, etc. And we also tend to forget that COVID literally collapsed what were already struggling economies in South America. And this, forced many migrants, not just Haitians, I will speak about the Venezuelan case in a little while, to leave these countries and to move, north in search of what we all want, a life where we can support our families and support ourselves. So this happens in a context of, increased enforcement by Mexico, and we cannot forget, Mexico's responsibility when it comes to managing migration flows coming from Central and South America into the U.S. And unfortunately, we're seeing, what we consider an incredibly disappointing response from the Biden administration. It is clear, and I think we have all discussed this in different venues, that the U.S. lacks the infrastructure at the border to deal, with increased flows, and especially to deal with flows, as Andrew was saying, that come from different nationalities and not the more traditional ones. But the truth is that migration changes at a very fast pace. So if there is one call we make, is that migration systems, especially in destination countries, need to be adaptable, to needs. We have seen the images. The images speak for themselves. We hope the Biden administration fulfills its promise to investigate, because some of the images we have seen in the last few days are regretfully, images of abuses that should not be tolerated in any democratic society. Now, we are now speaking about the Haitians because, indeed, the Haitians at the U.S. border are coming in numbers we haven't seen in the past few months. But a few months ago, we were discussing the Venezuelans. In June and July, we also saw images of many Venezuelans crossing into the US. And again, I'm going to reiterate some points that I think are needed to contextualize the magnitude of the problem. The latest number provided by the UN indicate that at least 5.7 million Venezuelans have fled Venezuela, and most of them in the last 5 or 6 years. Now, if you take inter-American human rights standards into consideration, and you apply these principles that many Latin American countries have incorporated in their domestic legislations, Venezuelans are fleeing not just a humanitarian emergency, but a context where massive human rights violations occur. Again, under inter-American standards, they should be considered people in need of international protection. In 2018 and 2019, the UNHCR issued, strict recommendations to host countries to consider these protection needs when addressing the cases or the application of Venezuelans. If we take that context and that legal analysis in the picture, we're talking about refugee crisis. And we look at the number 5.7 million, which for some is a conservative number. We are then speaking about the world's second largest refugee crisis, the first one being Syria, of course. So that is a reality that we need to face and that governments in the regions need to face. The Americas host the second largest refugee crisis in the world. And what does that mean? What should that translate to? Well, it should translate in building, and I think Andrew said this as well, in building regional protection systems. What happens in reality? Countries, as we know, are very good at cooperating when it comes to building regional enforcement systems. So how to move away from designing and implementing regional enforcement system to designing and implementing a regional protection system is still an open question, and one in which I think we need to incorporate the principle of shared responsibility, but we also need by far more political will than what we have seen right now, because unfortunately, some countries have taken positive measures that we all applaud, like, Michael, you were talking about TPS for Venezuelans in the US. I think this is certainly a welcome measure. Colombia has, as you know, announced a very ambitious process of regularization for Venezuelans in Colombia. We need to see how that will be implemented, but I think the idea is a positive and a welcome one. But I will, conclude by saying a couple of things. What happens in South America, not just what happens in Central America and Mexico, what happens in South America is going to impact the US one way or another, either right now or in the next few months and in the next few years. So it's very important that the US administration and the civil society continues tracking the trends there. This year, at least 46,000 Venezuelans have crossed the border into the US, according to, very good data provided by our colleagues in Creative Associate. And although this does not seem like a large number compared to other nationalities, of course, this is incredibly unusual. I mean, Venezuelans were traditionally crossing into Colombia, although the rate has decreased a little since the pandemic started because of the closure of the border and among other issues. But that trend is very likely to continue for one, very clear reason, and it's that the push factors are likely to deepen in the next few months. I mean, Venezuela has one of the lowest rates of vaccinations in the entire region. The political crisis is very much a daily reality. As you know, a negotiation process between the Venezuelan opposition and the Maduro government is taking place in Mexico, but it has just started and we don't know the outcomes of this process. So the political conflict is very present in people's realities. And then the humanitarian emergency is overwhelming. There is no other way to describe it. At least 1/3 of Venezuelans are in a situation of food insecurity, and although some or more humanitarian aid is coming into the country, it's still, very insufficient when compared to people's needs. So in this, very dire scenario, migration is not a choice. It's basically the only option left for many families, not only facing food insecurity, but also facing different types of health problems, included consequences of the pandemic. So I think, again, as I said at the beginning, it's very important to think regionally about what is, and I will insist on this, a refugee crisis, a very large one that deserves attention and also deserves funding and international cooperation, because it's also known that it's one of the most underfunded crises in the region. I will conclude by saying that, and I love the title of this panel, The Changing Phases of Migration. We can hardly cope with the changes, I have to say. I mean, they happen so fast that it is true that many governments are not prepared, for the changes. But I think we need to remember that I think all of us who are in this panel and many of you listening to what we're saying, 10 years ago, only 10 years ago, we're discussing, that migration, the net migration rates from Mexico to the US have fallen to zero. And I was personally working with the Jesuit Refugee Service in the Colombian-Venezuelan border when the Colombians were refugees and Venezuela was the host country. 10 years later, we're now again counting the number of Mexicans coming into the US, and I think Andrew made some very good points around that. And what we perhaps never expecting, Venezuela went in a matter of a decade, which is not a very long time in the history of a country, from a country that hosted some of the largest migration flows in South America to a country that expels refugees. And those changes imply that our governments need to adapt, to the fast pace and the dynamics of a phenomenon that is here to stay because it has historically been a part of our life, but political realities as well as natural disasters, etc., affect the way people move across the region. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carolina. That was terrific. Really, really helpful. Let's turn now to Daniela, who joins us from Quito, to share a perspective about what's happening from Ecuador, where, as I mentioned at the outset, the numbers have really shot up, and what's going on there, and also you're welcome to comment on some of the other issues that have already been raised. So Daniela, thank you so much. Turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and especially Manuel, for the invitation. For me, it's a great pleasure to be here and discuss about the region, because, you know, many times we are discussing within the country, but I think, like Carolina said already, I think we must think regional. So as you know, Ecuador challenges a lot of dimensions, migration dimensions right now. I mean, as Carolina pointed out, Ecuador is the third and almost the fourth country with the highest amount of Venezuelans right now in the country. But we have a big question right now, and it's about immigration. And as you said, and as we exchanged with Manuel, we just we're talking about the numbers, about the people who is trying to cross the borders from USA, but from the United States, but we are looking at a kind of a new phenomena, and it's pointed out as a new phenomena. And my argument right now is going to be like, it's not really new, because we have a lot of historical migration to US through Mexico, right? We know a lot of cases about smuggling, and Ecuador is really well known for it. But what we have right now is alarming numbers from the foreign ministry. For example, in Ecuador is talking about 62,000 Ecuadorians that have been detained by the border patrol in the states of Arizona, New Mexico, California, and Texas. In the same period, we have like more than 80,000 Ecuadorians that have traveled to Mexico. And we are like looking at the numbers, and we are talking about that 7 out of every 10 Ecuadorians who pass through Mexico were detained by US authorities and returned to Mexican territory. I don't know why I cannot share my screen, but I wanted to show you a graphic where the peaks are, you know, about the people who are going who are leaving the country and are going to Mexico, and we see peaks right and from 2018 going up. Because Mexico just put away the visa for Ecuadorians, so it helped to increase this number. The thing is, although we have this increase in between 2018 and 2020, and more with the pandemic, I agree with my colleagues that just pointed out the importance of the consequences of migration and the pandemic. But we have a lot of numbers like growing up before the pandemic also in Ecuador, because we have an economic crisis going on since 2014, 2015. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about this kind of factors and push factors that are provoking this immigration flows. We knew that this is a historic process. In Ecuador, we have a lot of immigration to the US since the last 7 decades, but we have different waves of immigration. So in the 80s, we have a peak going on, and in the second dimension, the second biggest dimension of immigration in Ecuador was in 2000. And after that, the migration flow came a slow down because between 2008 and 2013. But in 2014, when the price of crude oil fell and Ecuador began to enter an economic recession, the departure of Ecuadorians abroad increased, mostly to the US. This last migratory movement is at least 7 years old. Now the huge peak we see this year is a direct effect of the pandemic. I quote there a colleague that makes some research about it, Soledad Alvarez, and they research about this kind of historic process, but they went to the date from 2018 to March 2020, and they are pointing out that there are a large increase of Ecuadorians going to Mexico. That's That's a big number, but as we saw in this historic argument that I'm making, is that these migration flows were still increasing since 2018. So it's I mean it's a peak going. The migration flow increased. But it was increasing already since 2018. So I was asking me why, which explanations can we do with this phenomena? And I'm going to stay some economic issues and political issues in this short time. I hope I can reach this short time, but afterwards we can discuss about it. Economic issues, as pointed out in this interesting paper of Manuel Orozco, I think it's the same in Ecuador, but in another dimension. For example, the labor market conditions have been worse, and the unemployment raised, especially for young people. In the pandemic, it raised it more, and you have there like the other challenge in Ecuador, like receiving migrants from Venezuela. So we are facing these two dimensions in the same time. That's a very hard work within the country, and there's a lot of discussion going on integration and inclusion policy, and I'm going to make the details after this. Economic reasons. So the rural problematic remains unresolved always. That's inequality going on because you have unemployment in urban spaces, but also in rural spaces. And in rural spaces is mostly bigger than urban spaces. So I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion if we put these dimensions, that we put this difference between urban spaces and rural spaces. Although we know that the urban migration in Latin America is it's the most relevant, but migration is also in rural spaces in Ecuador going on. So the transnational ties are also a good factor and a good explanation, because we have, as I explained at the beginning, we have a lot of historical migration going on to the US through Mexico. And there are a lot of families who has ties in the US. So they are maybe reunifying families, or the children who stayed at home, they are going to the US. And we have a lot of data who stated also that unaccompanied adolescent and children are going also in these migration flows, and these amounts are increasing. So about political issues in Ecuador, we have a lot of protests going on in 2019 about ending fuel subsidies. The government reduced the state workforce and planned some privatization. So the fact that the people are believing that conditions are worse in the country is also an explanation for growing migration flows. And I have a little fact about remittances in Ecuador. They are, of course, as we quoted, as Manuel just wrote it in the paper, they are also, they went down because of the pandemic, as the tendency in Latin America, and they are growing now and increasing in 2000 in this year. So these remittances at the most, and this with this fact I'm finishing because we're running out of time. But I wanted to say that remittances that are coming to the regions, to four principal regions in Ecuador. There are Guayas, Azuay, Pichincha, and Cañar. And these are the provinces where the migrants are going abroad. So it would be interesting to research what is the correlation between remittances that are decreasing and the people who are going abroad. And this could be also an explanation that people are becoming a reduced amount of remittances, so they are like more dependent on migrating for their families and for the economic substances. So, and there, to final point I wanted to show you is that historical migrations in the region are very important to explain this phenomena also. That was my argument. And the second one is, I think we have to move to legal pathways, I also agree, but also to inclusion policy, because I think integration and inclusion policy could help in the regions where the people are going abroad, but also in the regions where the people also live, where the transnational ties are being constructed, and this oblige the people who keep deciding to migrate. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Danielle. Very, very interesting presentation, and I'm sure we'll be following up. Before I turn it over to Manuel for the final intervention, I just want to remind participants to submit questions using the Q&A function in Zoom, or you can email them at meetings@thedialogue.org. Manuel, a lot of points out there, and perhaps in addition to what's been said, you might want to say something about the Nicaragua phenomena, and also we really haven't discussed remittances. I think that would be interesting, and you're the guru on that subject, so maybe you can comment on that. Manuel, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, we'll have a remittances session especially for that, and talk about Bitcoin.
Maybe just
let me just raise a couple of points, something like completing some of Andrew's reflections and issues, except in the case of Mexico. I think we have a slight disagreement over the issue of increase, but I think the first point with Andrew that is consistent is that conversation we had about 3 years ago about Latin American migration focused on two main issues. One was that there was an increase of migration, and that increase was mostly explained by fragile states. So we had Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, mostly exhibiting an increasing pattern of out-migration, and Colombia and Ecuador to some extent. The second point, which Andrew mentioned, was that we saw that the migration was going south. It's not that migration to the US was slowing down, but we also had that growth moving in the south direction, to Peru, to Ecuador, to Colombia, to Costa Rica, Panama, and even the Dominican Republic receiving Venezuelans, for example. So what has happened today with this doubling of migration, even if we control for migrant recidivism, as we call it, from 2019 to 2021, there is still a significant increase. And there is an important phenomenon here that is shaping the out-migration, and is mostly economic, but also related to health conditions. And that is that the pandemic basically came to put a halt, and I think Andrew alluded to that, to the frustrations that were growing up in 2019 and were likely to explode in social protest in 2020. It put a halt, but at the same time, the state capacity to have the resilience to adapt to the growing pressures of the pandemic were not enough. And it actually has been slowly in several countries, the state being unable to address policy responses to deal with the pandemic, in economic, in health, in education, to the extent to which it's like a bubble bursting with all things all together. And that's what we're referring to, the complexities of migration coming all together during this pandemic. And one of the consequences of that is frustration that is manifested itself in growing protest, even in the middle of this process, but also with migration. So you see that growth of people coming out from different countries. In Mexico, for example, we find an interesting relationship with the contagion rates in the different states of Mexico and the number of migrants coming out of those places. There is something of a phenomenon that I sort of reflecting on it that I'm calling vaccine migration. That is, in countries where there is poor migration, vaccine management and treatment of COVID, adequate treatment, with states, institutions collapsing in the healthcare system, for example, Guatemala and a state of calamity, or even migrant host countries like Costa Rica, which was, doing pretty well up until October, and then they don't have a substantively below average vaccination rate in the Americas. Migrants have not been able in these host countries to handle, to receive the vaccine. They are at the bottom of the list in practical terms for those who are in a irregular status. So I think there is an opting out phenomenon going on that explained that increase of migration associated to migration from third countries. So Venezuelans might be explaining that. Nicaraguans is definitely an interesting case. Haitians and Cubans too. What's happening with Nicaragua is that, the intention to migrate has increased with the government repression since 2018. In 2019, we did a study about the intention to migrate, and 19% of households had an intention to migrate. In 2020, with the exacerbation of the pandemic and the economic crisis, the intention increased to 35%. In 2021, that intention remained that high. And it's as high as the intention to migrate from El Salvador, which is 36%. Now, unlike previous times, Nicaraguan migration has actually increased north rather than south to Costa Rica. The number of Nicaraguans going to Costa Rica this year will be less than 50,000, but the number of Nicaraguans coming to the United States will be as close as 60,000 or more. And that's basically an increase from 10,000 in 2019 and 3,000 in 2018, who were caught at the border with the United States and Mexico. That increase is definitely demonstrated that people have learned some of the patterns associated with the group migration. And that it's an important issue to highlight, because definitely there is a strong relationship between the level of repression in Nicaragua and the out-migration of people. 60,000 together is about 120,000 Nicaraguans who will live this year out of their country. That's 2% of the population, as many as the percentage of migrants that are living relative to their population from the other Central American countries. So, what can be done? And Andrew addressed some of these issues. I think the way I put it is that there are two simultaneous asynchronic ways to deal with this. One is through humanitarian urgent approach to migration from several countries, a humanitarian approach dealing with the US-Mexico border, but also with countries with migrant host countries in Costa Rica, in Panama, with migrants are facing really food security problems. They are not able to feed themselves for weeks. Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, Chile, and the Dominican Republic. The humanitarian response not only has to do with feeding people, with addressing their immediate needs, but also with COVID itself. Then we have economic diplomacy. And I'm calling it economic diplomacy as an approach that we need to address that has to come with an economic stabilization strategy, but also accompanied with some commitments and compromises from different states. And here, some of the recommendations we made in this 3 years ago in this event remain the same. That is that we understand that migrants are here to stay. Whether they are coming to the United States or whether they are going to other countries, the intention to migrate and the intention to stay in the host country is likely to stay. Therefore, the issue of integration really needs to be addressed automatically, systematically. Andrew addressed to that with the US congressional political process, but we need to look at the other countries that will continue to host migrants in the longer term. The other issue is that we do have an important reality, and that's remittances. People continue to send money. This year, remittances to the entire Latin American and Caribbean countries will increase over 22%. But for Central America and the Caribbean, they're growing 30%. And there is an urgent necessity to leverage those funds to mitigate further migration. People do not want to migrate. They are doing it out of the chaos that is taking place, the collapse of the healthcare institutions, the deterioration of the education system, and definitely the effect that it has had the pandemic on economic insecurity. And so you have to address this by looking at different alternatives. The Biden strategy on the root causes of migration has an important stress on the economic issue. And one of those issues includes financial inclusion. But we also need to stretch a little bit more the scope of the Biden strategy to other countries like Nicaragua and Haiti, because the reality is that this migration is reaching a broader scale, not only in terms of the countries, but also in terms of the numbers. And there is one third issue, and I'm going to finish here, but when we talk about the changing face of migration, which is an issue we were pointing out a little bit 3 years ago, but now has become more of a pattern, is that remember that 2/3 of migrants that are coming in are adults, but 1/3 are minors. Whether they're coming unaccompanied or not, the issue is that there is a significant number of minors that are also getting out of their home countries. And in some places, like in those of Central America, the number of minors getting out is as large as the annual matriculation rate increase from their home countries. So you do have a serious problem, a serious reality. I don't want to call it a crisis because we're past crisis in the same way that we're past resilience. So we really need to act on a humanitarian approach as well as with an economic diplomacy to establish an economic stabilization strategy at this point. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Manuel. That was really interesting and very useful. I'm conscious of our time, and I want to go to some of our good questions from our participants. But let me just ask, if I could, and really, if each of you has a thought about this. You know, I think there seems to be sort of an agreement among all the speakers that, you know, as Andrew said, the big change are new nationalities and migration, you know, not only to the US, but also, you know, just throughout the hemisphere. And just curious to know the views of each of you about what are the possible, you know, you all argue for a regional approach, so-called regional approach, you know, and what are the real possibilities of that, of achieving that, or moving towards something like a regional approach? And what are the obstacles? And do you see any grounds for, you know, for optimism that, you know, that the current patterns are going to create some pressure really for a more greater leadership and a more effective response? And, you know, is there, or are, you know, Andrew also mentioned that the word we don't like to raise in this, but politics, you know, I'm talking about US politics, but there's also politics in everyone, you know, in every country. And is this something where the politics are moving in a positive direction, or really it's going to be very, very difficult? I just would welcome a comment from each of you on that. Maybe start with Andrew and then go to Carolina, Daniela, and Manuel.
You know, I think the temptation is always to fix the border, you know, whatever the latest border crisis is. We treat it as a unique crisis. This is new. It's never happened before. And we're going to fix it with whatever the latest flavor of the day is, temporary measure, and telling Mexico to do more. You know, and that's sort of our repertoire, right? Mexico does more enforcement on the southern border. We do some enforcement measures at the border. I do think there's an appetite in this administration to do more and to think regionally. I think it's on paper. They've embraced a regional approach. They actually have a regional migration management strategy and a root causes strategy. That said, it's hard for governments, you know, especially the US government, which is so decentralized in so many ways, to do things that are outside its usual repertoires. And I think it remains to be seen. Something like creating legal pathways, does it get traction? You know, some things are easier. They can work with countries like Colombia and Ecuador that are doing legalization programs to make sure they're done well, to support them, to, you know, really more than make sure they're done well, really just to support them, to make sure that they can do them effectively, that they can do the integration strategies that really have to follow And these are quite massive programs. The one in Colombia is ongoing. The one in Ecuador, the president has talked about several times, and we hear is about to happen. That those are the kind of things that can be done, with resources. So it's doable, yes. Is there the political will, and is there enough attention, consistent attention from someone, well placed in the administration to make sure this happens? I don't know. That's the eternal problem in policy, and it's always easy to go back to the quick fixes rather than try and do the long-term stuff. That said, the one thing that may motivate them this time is we're in the first year of the Biden administration. They actually have a political incentive to get this right, to try and do the things that are a little more, make sure that we're not back in the same place next year, in 2 years, in 3 years. And so I think there's maybe a political incentive in addition to some vision on how you do this, so you make sure you're not just doing patchwork every time.
Great, thank you. Carolina, let me turn to you, and let me also just ask you about the Colombian, the Duque administration had a very, bold and I think very welcome position on Venezuelan migrants, but I don't see a lot of other governments kind of falling in line, or maybe they have. I mean, how do you see that? Is there any prospect for any kind of a coordinated regional response to that phenomena and other migrants?
That's a very good question, because indeed, Colombia has been congratulated on this initiative. And I think it will be very important for the Colombian government to show, that it can implement it, respecting standards, etc., but also addressing other, the situation of other migrants who are also in Colombia, either in transit or who have made Colombia, their country of destination, that also need support, from the Colombian government. And of course, we need to add the whole issue around IDP. So Colombia has great challenges when it comes to human mobility. And yes, we do welcome, the initiative to regularize Venezuelans, but clearly, they have a lot to do around human displacement in general. I have to say that it's disappointing not to see, this initiative replicated in other countries. On the contrary, as with the justification of the pandemic, we know that in Peru, for example, in Ecuador, there has been an increase in the number of military personnel at the border. And a few months ago, we saw some very alarming scenes of military shooting and to the air, but that families were coming into Peru at that moment. The situation hasn't necessarily changed. I mean, the border continues. The Peruvian-Ecuadorian border continues to be a difficult place to cross. And then we have Chile, which is a very important receiving country, with deportation flights here and there. And the Chilean Supreme Court has said that many of these flights are unconstitutional. The UN rapporteur on migrants has called on the Chilean government to stop massive deportation flights, etc., but they continue happening. So I think, unfortunately, perhaps in part because of the pandemic, but also because of the politics, as you were saying, Michael, we're now seeing countries in Latin America, especially in South America, organizing their efforts, to ensure that there is safe and ordered migration. I think before the pandemic, we saw some interesting processes, the Quito process, etc., where governments were meeting to try, to have the regional approach that we have been all calling for. But the pandemic came, to unfortunately ruin many of these efforts and to slow down some of these efforts that could have had a positive impact. So I think we now see that each country is, doing its own thing when you need countries to cooperate in order to ensure that protection is a regional reality and not a part of different moving pieces. So I think the challenges are great. Elections are coming into some of these countries. So I think we are going to, hear different views and we might see some major risks to some of the good policies that are going to be implemented. And that's what I think, we need to continue advocating for the respect of human rights of people in need of international protection, but also to, advocate for solutions that can be a win-win situation both for the countries of destination and for migrants and refugees themselves.
Great, thank you. Daniela, you have any thoughts on this question?
Yes, of course. I think South America has a big challenge with Venezuelan immigration, and we are seeing that same strategies are going on in Colombia and Peru and Ecuador. For Ecuador, I think the biggest challenge is to shift the policy to inclusion and integration, because we've seen the Venezuelan migration as a transit migration many years. So now is the biggest challenge to make like integration happen within Ecuador and within the region. And I think that's the biggest challenge right now. Of course, regularization, it's going to be a very big issue also. It's still a very big question in Ecuador because although the campaigns that the government had made, I think there's an open questions because there is not the expected amount of Venezuelans that have been regularized in these new campaigns. But right now is the biggest question, how are we going to offer Venezuelans also the opportunity to be integrated in work, for example, in social life. Xenophobic actions has been also happening in the region, in South America, and this rejection to Venezuelan population. So I think the big question is here: how are we going to offer them this possibility to integrate themselves, to have to become labor, to become a part of the society? And now, how, like I said before, we have two big challenges right now in Ecuador because the immigration is growing also, and this problematic it has to be shifted in this kind of questions. How can Ecuador also give this development perspective to these people who are emigrating, but how is Ecuador going to offer socio-economic integration for the incomings and for Venezuelans, for example, that are living in our country? We have this process also with Colombia and with Colombian refugees. For example, Ecuador was very open to refugees, and many Colombians just stayed here and are integrating themselves into the society. So now is this kind of question that we are looking, and as Carolina said, human mobility has a lot of dimensions, and I think that's the very big challenge for the government to deal with these dimensions, and give them the opportunity to decide if they want to stay or they want to migrate, but to make these possibilities better in economic ways also. No? As I say, the economical crisis in Ecuador has been very hard, and I think there is a lot of work with policy and integration and about budgets. No? How countries in South America can just afford these new phenomena, and I think that's a very big question, an economic question also in our continent.
Great, thanks. Manuel, you have any thoughts on the regional approach idea?
Just two things. The regional approach is twofold. One is with migrant sending countries, and the other one is with migrant host countries. With migrant sending countries, I think it's really important to go back to this issue of the economics, because it addresses the humanitarian challenges on the spot for people who are having food security, loss of employment, and also vaccine problems. Second, one of the issues that Andrew raised, which we haven't talked too much about, is the H visa, especially in my perspective, the H-2B visa, the low skill visa that can actually be doubled or tripled, especially from Central American countries, can really mitigate the size of migration coming out of those countries. There is a demand for foreign labor on this side. It's not a demand from agricultural labor, it's a demand for low-skilled labor working in segments where there is demand in construction, in healthcare services, in the hospitality industry, etc. And on the migrant host country regional cooperation approach is to have sort of a harmonized strategy on how to deal with integration of these populations, dealing with economic opportunities, but also with legal status and transnational links. And this is where issues relating to remittances play an important role, because they can actually be able to leverage to generate wealth and reduce migration. We know that remittances have the capacity to build assets, and there is a negative correlation between the intention to migrate and asset builds. So we need to leverage remittances precisely to address some of the root causes of migration, which are economic.
Great, thank you. That kind of brings me to a question that's been raised by a couple of our participants, and maybe turn to Andrew precisely about, there seems to be a few skeptics about the root causes approach, that the United States has already invested an enormous amount, and really the results haven't been very encouraging so far. Is this really worthwhile pursuing? And also, Andrew, I know that Migration Policy Institute has a lot, and does a lot in Europe as well. And there are a few questions here from participants, whether the EU experience has anything to teach Latin America, anything useful lessons? Is there any kind of worthwhile comparison, or is it instructive to look at the EU experience? But also just addressing sort of the root causes approach, whether that makes a lot of sense given the experience so far and given the results so far.
I mean, very briefly, it doesn't make sense if we think it's a quick fix for migration, for regular migration, right? Because there are things you can do in the short term. Let me say, there are things you can do in the short term that deal with specific triggers, short to medium term. You can figure out things about indebtedness, for example, around harvests, right? I mean, short-term indebtedness, which is something that's been increasing. People ask about climate. I mean, climate is changing. Rainfall patterns are changing so much, people get indebted, and then it's a bad harvest, either because of too much rain or too little. So you can do things around that. You can do things in the short term around remittances that Manuel talked about, on financial inclusion, making sure remittances get into financial institutions that actually lend in local communities, things that might give some people a reason not to migrate in the short term, right? So you can certainly do things around internally displaced people that might give people, who want to stay in their country, an option beyond, leaving the country and getting to the US border, right? So yeah, there are things you can do in the short term, but we have to assume that the root cause of the strategy is a bet for the medium to long term, and especially the long term. We have not been consistent in the US about rule of law issues, and particularly on governance issues, and making sure that we are concerned when corruption is evident, or when people try and undermine the democratic process. I think that's taken away from our credibility in the region. I think we may be overshooting right now and talking too much about rule of law. But that's a different question. Not that we shouldn't be doing it, but we should. I think sometimes you have to do it subtly rather than publicly shaming people. But that's always a balance. But I do think taking our foot off the pedal on this, particularly in the last administration, was a problem. And we let governments get away with things that they probably shouldn't. In the medium to long term, we really want a neighborhood that's stable, that's prosperous, where people, are better off and can dream of a future where they live. And so I think betting on that as a long-term opportunity is a smart bet, and it's something we should do, but we should have no illusions that this is going to stop, that this is a way of stopping migration or even slowing migration in the short term. It might slow some migration, it might might be able to address some specific triggers, but we should assume this is really a longer term bet. And it's a good bet to make. It's a good bet to make because we want to live, like all of us, we want to live in a neighborhood that's safe and prosperous, and everyone is living well, because that makes us safer and more prosperous, right? I mean, this is a mutually beneficial thing to do.
Just very quickly, Andrew, does the EU have anything to teach us, the EU experience on this?
I think people often try and leverage development funds by saying it's for migration because that's the subject of the moment, and I think that's a little bit the European experience as well as the U.S. experience. Is sometimes people will use whatever the going political debate is. Europe has a much bigger field to deal with. I mean, in the U.S., when we're talking about root causes, we're essentially talking about three countries: Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Right. We could expand that to think of, for example, Haiti, right, which has a very close migration relationship with the US. We could think of a couple others, but generally speaking, we're thinking of a bounded problem set. That is much more doable than what Europe is dealing with, where they have 54 countries in Africa, not all of which had migrants, by the way, not all of which are large migrant setting, but they are thinking about multiple dozens of countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia that have migration relationships with Europe. Europe tends to do it in more of a scattershot approach because that's what they have to do. I mean, they're dealing with just multiple countries. We are dealing with a fairly bounded problem set and with two really good allies. I mean, the other thing is we should be talking with Canada and Mexico actively about what our strategy is. I mean, this is the task force that Michael referenced earlier too. We have two pretty good partners, one of which is a developed country, which is an emerging country, but a fairly consolidated one. We should be thinking about a North American position together with Central America. But this is, again, as long as our expectations are realistic, we actually have an easier set of challenges than Europe does in looking more broadly across the globe, at least on this set of issues, right? I mean, the US has other migration concerns in the world, but at least when we talk about Central America, we're talking about a defined set of countries.
Right. Thank you. Carolina, I'm going to give you the last word on this. We reached the end of our time, but I want to get your view on this root causes approach. Is it the right one? Do you agree with Andrew, or is it something that really is not working?
I think it is a really important approach because, of course, as I said during my presentation, migration starts at the communities of origin, right? Not at the US-Mexico border. Right. So yes, I mean, it is an important bet, as Michael was saying, but it cannot be a short-term one, and that's part of the problem. I'm always afraid, and we have seen this over and over throughout, for decades, that good intentions change during elections, of course, and different types of elections. And if there is no consistency in the plans and important initiatives are co-opted by toxic narratives as part of, electoral politics, we lose sight of the ultimate goals. And we're very concerned that this could be the case, with the regional approach that the Biden administration, promised to have. I think it will also be very important to see in terms of consistency some of the principles, contained in these strategies are not then changed for promises of greater enforcement, both in Central America and in Mexico. And, we're always afraid that could be happening. The region faces major challenges when it comes to addressing these root causes because we're seeing setbacks, major democratic setbacks in these three countries of the Northern Triangle, and it's exactly the opposite, what we were hoping to see with some new administrations in Guatemala, and well, not so new anymore, but in Guatemala and in Salvador, and there's a big question mark around Honduras, and of course there is Nicaragua, which, as we know, will continue to be a major challenge for the entire region as Ortega literally consolidates a very authoritarian style of leadership. So the approach is not the wrong one, but as usual, there's this expression, I think in English as well, right? The devil is in the details. I mean, implementing this type of approaches have a lot of challenges, and consistency will be a key principle if the US truly wants to change what are structural problems and that impact, people's decision to whether migrate or stay in their home countries. And if some of these principles are not really kept beyond the changes of electoral politics, I'm afraid that we won't see some of these goals achieved in the medium and long term.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm sorry, we're going to have to end on that note, but this has been a really, I think, fascinating and illuminating discussion, and really I've learned a lot. And I think, as all of you have said, this is moving quickly. So I'm sure we're going to have to come back and reconvene again and update even more and shed more light. But all of you have been absolutely terrific. So I want to thank Andrew and Carolina and Daniela joining us from Quito, and of course Manuel for his contribution, and also for his help in putting together this event. Really, thank you so much. And I want to thank our participants. Sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions, but I'm sure you can reach out to all of the panelists and they'd be happy to respond. Manuel, some have asked about the data that's been cited in this discussion, and Manuel has posted that, his paper, so you can find all the data there. If anybody wants to reference that, feel free to do so. And I want to thank Gaston for all of his help in organizing this, Ocampo, and I'm sure we'll be coming back and reconvening. This is an issue that's not going to go away, but I think this was very timely, and want to thank everybody for doing this, and also wishing everybody the best, and stay safe and stay healthy and take good care of yourselves, and we'll continue to be in touch. Thank you all very, very much. Take care.